There are moments in life when the world stops moving, when your breath catches in your throat and everything you thought you knew begins to crumble. For Margaret, that moment came on a Tuesday morning in the pale light of dawn. She stood in her bedroom, staring at the walnut jewelry box on her dresser. The lid was open. The velvet interior, once cradling her wedding ring, her grandmother's pearls, the sapphire earrings her husband had given her on their 20th anniversary, was empty. Completely empty. Her hands trembled as she lifted the box, turning it over as if the jewelry might simply reappear, but there was nothing. Just the faint imprint on the velvet where each piece had rested for years. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." Margaret sat down on the edge of her bed, the box clutched against her chest. Those weren't just pieces of jewelry. They were her history, her mother's history. 4 generations of women who had worn those pearls, who had passed down that sapphire set like a promise that love endures, that family matters, that some things are sacred. And now they were gone. She heard footsteps in the hallway, the familiar shuffle of her son's morning routine. Ethan, sweet, troubled Ethan, who'd moved back home 3 weeks ago with his new wife, Clara. "Just temporarily," he'd said, his eyes avoiding hers, "just until we get back on our feet." Margaret had said yes without hesitation. What else could a mother do? But now, standing in her bedroom with an empty jewelry box in her hands, she wondered if kindness could be a mistake. "Mom?" Ethan appeared in the doorway, his hair still messy from sleep. "You okay? I heard you moving around." Margaret looked at him, really looked at him. At 32, he still had the face of the boy she'd raised. Soft brown eyes, a nervous smile, the same way of running his hand through his hair when he was uncomfortable. "Ethan," she said quietly, "my jewelry is missing." The color drained from his face. "What?" "All of it. The pearls, the sapphire set, my wedding ring, everything your grandmother gave me, everything I was supposed to give to—" She stopped herself. She'd been about to say, "your wife someday," but Clara was already his wife, and now those pieces were gone. Ethan stepped into the room, his eyes wide. "Mom, I don't know anything about this, I swear." "When did you last see them?" "I don't know. I don't go through your things." He looked genuinely panicked. "Maybe you moved them, put them somewhere safe?" Margaret shook her head slowly. "I check them every Sunday. Last Sunday, they were right here." Ethan ran both hands through his hair now, pacing. Okay, let's think. Could someone have broken in? Did you check the windows?" "Nothing else is missing, just the jewelry." The silence between them was heavy, suffocating. Margaret watched her son's face, saw the wheels turning behind his eyes. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him. But then she heard footsteps on the stairs. Lighter. Quicker. "Clara." "Good morning." Clara's voice was bright, cheerful. She appeared in the hallway wearing one of Margaret's old robes, her blonde hair pulled into a messy bun. Ethan turned to his wife. "Clara, Mom's jewelry is missing. All of it." Something flickered across Clara's face, just for a second. A flash of what? Fear? Guilt? It was gone so quickly, Margaret almost thought she'd imagined it. "Oh my God," Clara said, pressing a hand to her chest. "That's terrible. When did this happen?" "That's what we're trying to figure out," Margaret said slowly, watching Clara's face. "I saw them last Sunday. Now they're gone." Clara's eyes darted to Ethan, then back to Margaret. "Should we call the police?" "I don't think we need to involve the police," Ethan said quickly. I'm sure they'll turn up, right, Mom? But Margaret wasn't sure of anything anymore. She looked at her son, her only child, the boy she'd sacrificed everything for after his father died, and she looked at Clara, the woman he'd married 6 months ago in a courthouse ceremony Margaret hadn't even been invited to. Maybe you're right, Margaret heard herself say. Maybe I just misplaced them. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. Clara smiled, a small, tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I'm sure they'll turn up. Things always do. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Margaret went through the motions, making coffee, answering emails, pretending everything was normal. But she couldn't stop thinking about that empty jewelry box, couldn't stop seeing that flicker of something in Clara's eyes. That evening, she made dinner for the 3 of them. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, Ethan's favorite. They sat around the dining table, the sound of silverware against plates filling the silence. "This is delicious, Margaret," Clara said, smiling across the table. "You're such an amazing cook." "Thank you," Margaret replied, her voice neutral. Ethan barely touched his food. He kept glancing at his wife, then at his mother, tension radiating from every muscle in his body. After dinner, Margaret excused herself early. "I'm tired," she said. "I think I'll turn in." She climbed upstairs to her bedroom, but she didn't get ready for bed. Instead, she sat in the darkness by her window, looking out at the street below. The house was quiet, too quiet. And then around 11 o'clock, she heard it, a whisper, coming from the guest room where Ethan and Clara slept. She stood, moving carefully across her room to the door. She opened it a crack, just enough to hear. "Told you to be careful," Clara's voice hushed but urgent. I know, but she's my mother, Clara. If she finds out..." "She won't. Not if we stick to the plan." Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. "I just feel terrible," Ethan said. "She doesn't deserve this." "Stop it," Clara hissed. "We agreed. This is the only way." There was a long pause. Then Clara spoke again, her voice so soft, Margaret had to strain to hear it. "He doesn't suspect a thing." Margaret stepped back from the door, her hand pressed against her mouth. He doesn't suspect a thing. Who was Clara talking about? Her son? Or someone else entirely? She stood in the darkness of the hallway, her entire world tilting on its axis. Those pearls, that sapphire set, they weren't just jewelry. They were the only pieces of her past she had left, the only tangible connection to her mother, her grandmother, the life she'd built with her husband before cancer stole him away. And now they were gone. And her son, her sweet, troubled son, knew something he wasn't telling her. Margaret returned to her bedroom and closed the door softly behind her. She didn't turn on the light. She simply sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the empty jewelry box in the moonlight. Somewhere in the house, Clara laughed, soft and musical. And Margaret realized, with a cold certainty that settled into her bones, that she didn't know the woman her son had married at all. 1 week earlier, Margaret had been happy. Or at least she'd convinced herself she was. It was a Sunday afternoon, the kind of day that smells like possibility. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows as Margaret prepared lunch, humming along to an old jazz record. She'd set the table for 3, using the good china for the first time in months. Ethan and Clara were coming home. Well, not home exactly. They were coming to stay, temporarily. But to Margaret, it felt like a beginning. Like maybe after 2 years of rattling around this big empty house alone, she might have a family again. The doorbell rang at exactly 1 o'clock. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and rushed to the door, her heart fluttering with an excitement she hadn't felt in years. When she opened it, there was Ethan, thinner than she remembered, with dark circles under his eyes, but smiling. "Hey, Mom!" Margaret pulled him into a hug, breathing in the familiar scent of him. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm so glad you're here." Behind him stood Clara, elegant in a cream-colored dress, her blonde hair perfectly styled. She smiled, a camera-ready smile that belonged in a magazine. "Margaret, thank you so much for having us." Of course, of course. Come in, come in." Margaret ushered them inside, talking too fast, laughing too loud, all the things she did when she was nervous. She helped them carry boxes upstairs to the guest room, watching as Clara examined the space with those calculating blue eyes. "It's lovely," Clara said. "So cozy." That afternoon, they sat in the living room drinking tea while Ethan explained their situation. His voice was careful, measured, like he was trying to tell a story he'd rehearsed. He said, "The company downsized, 30% of the staff. He looked at his hands. "I was one of them." "Oh, honey," Margaret reached for his hand. "I'm so sorry." "And our landlord raised the rent," added Clara smoothly, "by almost 40%. We needed some time to figure things out." "Of course," Margaret said quickly. "Stay as long as you need. This is your home." But even as she said it, something felt off. Ethan wouldn't meet her eyes, and Clara's story, the way she told it, the details she emphasized, felt rehearsed, polished, like a performance. Still, Margaret pushed those thoughts aside. Her son needed her. That was all that mattered. The first few days were nice, almost normal. Margaret would wake up to the sound of voices in the kitchen, the smell of coffee brewing. She'd find Ethan and Clara at the breakfast table, bent over laptops, supposedly job hunting. "Any luck?" Margaret would ask. "A few leads," Ethan would say, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. In the evenings, they'd have dinner together. Margaret cooked the meals from Ethan's childhood: pot roast, spaghetti carbonara, apple pie. Clara would compliment everything, her praise always a bit too enthusiastic, a bit too perfect. "You're such an amazing cook, Margaret. Ethan's told me so much about your lasagna." But Ethan had never liked lasagna. He'd hated it as a child, picking out every bit of ricotta cheese. Margaret noticed these small inconsistencies, the way Clara's stories shifted. One day she'd grown up in Ohio. The next it was Pennsylvania. She'd mentioned having a brother once, then later said she was an only child. "You said you had a brother," Margaret ventured one evening, trying to sound casual. Clara's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Oh, I meant stepbrother. From my father's second marriage, we weren't close." The explanation was smooth, effortless, but it didn't erase the fact that the story had changed. Ethan never seemed to notice, or if he did, he didn't say anything. He'd become quieter since moving in, more withdrawn. He spent hours in the guest room with Clara, their voices low murmurs Margaret couldn't quite make out. At night, lying in bed, Margaret would stare at the ceiling and wonder if she was imagining things. Maybe Clara was just nervous, trying too hard to fit in. Maybe the inconsistencies were innocent mistakes. But then there was the phone call. It was Thursday evening. Margaret had gone upstairs to put away laundry when she heard Clara's voice coming from the guest room. "No, I told you it's fine. He doesn't know anything. Just a few more days, okay?" Margaret froze in the hallway, a stack of folded towels in her arms. "Look, I have to go," Clara said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I'll call you tomorrow." Who was she talking to? And what didn't Ethan know? Margaret continued down the hall, her mind racing. She put the towels in the linen closet, then went downstairs where Ethan was watching television. "Everything okay?" she asked, settling into the armchair across from him. "Yeah, why?" "No reason, just, you seem stressed lately." Ethan exhaled slowly. "It's just the job hunt, harder than I thought it would be." Margaret nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he wasn't telling her, something bigger than unemployment and rent increases. The next morning, Friday, Margaret was having coffee on the porch when her neighbor Mrs. Chen walked by, walking her terrier. "Margaret, good morning." "Good morning, Helen." Mrs. Chen paused at the gate, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "I saw your daughter-in-law the other day, downtown, near Oak Street." Margaret smiled. "Oh?" "Yes, Tuesday afternoon. She was coming out of that pawn shop, the one next to the hardware store." Mrs. Chen leaned in, carrying a little envelope. I almost said hello, but she looked like she was in a hurry. The words landed like stones in Margaret's stomach. A pawn shop? No, it couldn't be. But the doubt, once planted, began to grow. That night at dinner, Margaret watched Clara carefully. The way she smiled, the way she touched Ethan's hand, the way her eyes never quite stayed in one place. "Clara," Margaret said casually, "what did you do on Tuesday?" Clara blinked. "Tuesday? I don't remember. Why?" "Just curious." "I think I went for a walk around the neighborhood." Clara's smile was bright, unbothered. "It was such a beautiful day." A walk around the neighborhood. Not downtown. Not near a pawn shop. Another lie. Margaret excused herself from dinner early, her appetite gone. She went upstairs and stood in her bedroom, looking at the jewelry box on her dresser. It had been full on Sunday, empty by Wednesday morning. And on Tuesday, Clara had been at a pawn shop. The pieces were there. Margaret just didn't want to put them together. Not yet. Not until she had proof. Margaret had never been the kind of woman to snoop. In 30 years of marriage, she'd never looked through her husband's phone, never opened his mail, never searched his pockets. Trust, she believed, was the foundation of love, and without trust, what did you really have? But on Saturday morning, standing in her laundry room with a basket of Clara's clothes, Margaret felt that foundation crack. The jeans were crumpled at the bottom of the hamper, designer denim that probably cost more than Margaret spent on groceries in a month. She pulled them out, checking the pockets before tossing them in the washing machine. It was habit, nothing more. That's when she felt it. a piece of paper, folded small and tight, stuffed deep into the front right pocket. Margaret's hands trembled as she unfolded it. It was a pawn receipt, yellow and official, with Gold Star Pawn and Loan printed across the top in bold letters. Date, Tuesday, April 18th. Items, pearl necklace, vintage, sapphire earrings, matching set, estimated 1960s, gold wedding band, engraved. Loan amount, $3,200. Signature, Ethan Reeves. The paper slipped from Margaret's fingers, fluttering to the floor. Ethan, her son. He'd signed it, put his signature on the line, walked into that pawn shop with her mother's pearls, her grandmother's sapphires, her husband's wedding ring, and traded them for $3,200. $3,200 for 4 generations of love and history. The rational part of Margaret's brain tried to make excuses. Maybe he was desperate. Maybe Clara was sick and needed medical care. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation that would make this all make sense. But the other part, the part that had heard Clara's whispered phone conversations, that had noticed the lies, the inconsistencies, that part knew better. Margaret picked up the receipt and stared at it until the numbers blurred together. She stayed in the laundry room for a long time, listening to the house around her. Ethan and Clara were upstairs, their voices occasionally drifting down, too quiet to make out words, but loud enough to know they were talking, planning something, hiding something. Finally, Margaret folded the receipt carefully and tucked it into her pocket. She finished the laundry mechanically, hanging clothes and folding towels while her mind raced through possibilities and scenarios. Should she confront him, show him the receipt, and demand an explanation? Or should she wait, watch, see what else she might discover? That evening, Margaret made spaghetti, another one of Ethan's childhood favorites. But when they sat down to eat, the tension at the table was thick enough to cut with a knife. Ethan pushed food around his plate, barely eating. Clara kept up a stream of cheerful chatter about job applications and apartment listings, but her smiles felt increasingly forced. "I had the most interesting call today," Clara said brightly. "A recruiter. They want to interview me on Monday." "That's wonderful," Margaret said, her voice flat. Ethan glanced at his wife, then at his mother. "Mom, are you okay? You seem off." "Just tired, sweetheart." But that night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the pawn receipt burning a hole in her nightstand drawer where she'd hidden it. Around midnight, she heard it. Voices, urgent and hushed. Margaret slipped out of bed and crept to her door, opening it just a crack. "I told you to get rid of that receipt," Ethan's voice, sharp with panic. "I thought I did. Where was it?" "I don't know, but if she finds it—" "She won't. Ethan, calm down. We've come this far. We just need a little more time." "A little more time for what?" Ethan's voice cracked. "Clara, I feel sick about this. She's my mother. She took us in when we had nowhere else to go, and we're doing what we have to do. Or have you forgotten why we're here?" Silence, long and terrible. "No," Ethan said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "I haven't forgotten." "Then trust me, everything's going according to plan." Margaret stood frozen in her doorway, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. According to plan. This wasn't about unemployment or rent increases. This wasn't about bad luck or hard times. This was deliberate, calculated, planned. But planned for what? Margaret returned to her bed, but didn't close her eyes. She waited, listening until the house fell silent again. Then she got up, pulled on her robe, and went downstairs. In her small home office, she opened her laptop and typed Gold Star Pawn and Loan into the search bar. The shop's website appeared, garish yellow letters on a black background. She scrolled down to the How It Works section. Margaret closed the laptop and sat in the darkness of her office, surrounded by photos of Ethan at every age. Ethan at 5, missing his front teeth. Ethan at 12, holding his first trophy. Ethan at 18, graduation cap askew, grinning at the camera. When had her sweet boy become someone she didn't recognize? Or maybe the question was, when had she stopped really seeing him? Sunday morning arrived with rain, heavy drops that streaked down the windows and turned the world gray. Margaret made pancakes, setting them on the table just as Ethan and Clara came downstairs. "Smells amazing," Clara said, sliding into her seat. Margaret said nothing. She poured orange juice with steady hands and sat down across from them. "So," she said carefully, "how's the job search going?" "Really?" Ethan looked up from his plate. It's going okay." "Any promising leads?" "A few. Nothing concrete yet." Margaret nodded slowly. "And financially, are you two doing all right? I know how expensive it is these days." "We're fine, Mom," Ethan said quickly. "We're managing." "Because if you needed money, you could always ask me. You know that, right?" The silence that followed was deafening. Clara's fork froze halfway to her mouth. Ethan's face went pale. "What do you mean?" he asked. Margaret met her son's eyes. "I mean, you don't have to sell precious things to survive. I mean, family helps each other." Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at Clara, some unspoken communication passing between them. "We'd never ask you for money, Margaret," Clara said smoothly. "You've already done so much by letting us stay here." "Have I?" Margaret asked softly. The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. That night, as Margaret lay in bed, her heart heard them arguing again. "She knows," Clara hissed. "She knows something." "You don't know that." "I do. The way she was looking at us, the questions. We need to move faster." "Clara, please. Can we just—" "No. No more waiting. Tomorrow, we finish this." Margaret pulled her blanket up to her chin, her entire body cold despite the warmth of the room. Tomorrow, they finished this. Whatever this was. And Margaret realized with growing dread that she was about to find out. Monday morning arrived with a strange electric tension in the air. Margaret woke early, dressed carefully, and went downstairs to make coffee. She was standing at the kitchen counter, watching the dark liquid drip into the pot, when she heard footsteps behind her. "Mom." She turned. Ethan stood in the doorway, still in his pajamas, his hair uncombed. He looked like he hadn't slept. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face pale. "We need to talk." Margaret's hands tightened around her coffee mug. "All right." Ethan sat down at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. For a long moment, he didn't speak. The only sound was the ticking of the wall clock and the distant hum of the refrigerator. "I sold your jewelry," he said finally, his voice cracking. "The pearls, the sapphires, your wedding ring. I took them to a pawn shop last Tuesday." Margaret already knew this, of course, but hearing him say it out loud made it real in a way it hadn't been before. She felt something inside her chest collapse. Why? The word came out as a whisper. Ethan looked up, tears streaming down his face. Clara was sick, is sick. She has, he swallowed hard. She has a medical condition, something with her heart. It was getting worse, and we didn't have insurance, and the bills were piling up, and I didn't know what else to do. Margaret stood frozen, the coffee mug shaking in her hands. I know I should have asked you first, Ethan continued, the words tumbling out faster now. I know I should have explained, but I was ashamed, Mom. I was supposed to take care of her. That's what husbands do, right? They take care of their wives, and I couldn't even afford her medication. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with sobs. Margaret set down her mug and crossed to the table. She knelt beside her son, placing a hand on his back, the way she had when he was a child waking from nightmares. Ethan, sweetheart, look at me. He raised his head, his face wet with tears. You should have told me, Margaret said softly. You should have come to me. I would have helped. I would have given you anything. I know. I wanted to handle it myself. I wanted to be strong enough to... His voice broke. I'm so sorry, Mom. I'll get them back. I'll find a way to get every piece back, I swear. Margaret pulled her son into her arms, and he clung to her like he used to when he was small and the world felt too big and scary. But even as she held him, even as she murmured reassurances, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered, "This doesn't add up." She thought of Clara's designer clothes, her expensive haircuts, the way she talked about that recruiter job like it was an afterthought. She thought of the whispered conversations, according to plan. This didn't feel like desperation. It felt like something else. But Ethan was crying in her arms, and he was her son. And what kind of mother doubted her son? It's okay, Margaret heard herself say. We'll figure it out together. We'll get the jewelry back. Thank you, Mom. Thank you so much. Footsteps on the stairs. Clara appeared, dressed and made up, looking impossibly put together for 8 in the morning. Oh, Ethan! She rushed over, her face a perfect mask of concern. You told her? Ethan nodded, wiping his eyes. Yeah, I told her. Clara turned to Margaret, and to Margaret's surprise, tears welled up in her eyes too. Margaret, I'm so sorry. This is all my fault. If I hadn't gotten sick, if I'd just taken better care of myself. Don't, Margaret said quickly. Don't apologize for being sick. Clara knelt beside them, and the three of them formed a strange tableau in the morning light. A broken family trying to hold itself together with apologies and tears. You've been so kind to us, Clara said, her voice trembling. Opening your home, feeding us, never asking questions, and this is how we repay you. I feel terrible. She did look terrible. Her face was pale, her hands shaking. For the first time since meeting her, Margaret saw something genuine in Clara's eyes. Fear. Real, palpable fear. It's okay, Margaret said, and part of her even meant it. She remembered being young and broke and terrified. She remembered selling her own possessions once, years ago, to pay for Ethan's school fees when her husband lost his job. You do things for the people you love, things you never thought you'd do. We'll sort this out, Margaret said firmly. All of us, together. Clara nodded, wiping her eyes. Thank you so much for understanding. That afternoon, Margaret sat in her office, looking at her bank statements. She could get the jewelry back. She had enough in her savings to cover the pawn shop loan plus interest. It would hurt, but she could do it. But something still nagged at her. She opened Google and typed Clara Reeves. Before Margaret could answer, there was a thunderous knock on the front door. "Police! Open up!" Margaret and Ethan looked at each other, and in that moment, she saw the truth written plainly on her son's face. He knew. Whatever was happening, whatever was about to happen, he knew. "Ethan?" Clara's voice, small and frightened, came from the guest room. "Ethan, what's going on?" The knocking came again, harder this time. Margaret descended the stairs on shaking legs. She could see shapes through the frosted glass of the front door, uniforms, flashlights, the outline of badges. She opened the door. 4 police officers stood on her porch, their expressions grim. "We have a warrant," the lead officer said, holding up a document, "for the arrest of Clara Reeves." The world tilted. Behind Margaret, she heard footsteps. Clara appeared at the top of the stairs, her face white as paper. "That's her," one of the officers said. And suddenly they were moving past Margaret, ascending the stairs, their heavy boots thudding against the hardwood. "Clara Reeves, you're under arrest for credit card fraud, identity theft, and trafficking in stolen property." The words became a blur. Margaret watched, frozen, as they handcuffed her daughter-in-law, as Clara cried out, pleading, as Ethan screamed that there must be some mistake. "You have the right to remain silent." They led Clara down the stairs. She was wearing only a nightgown, her feet bare, her face streaked with tears and mascara. "Margaret!" she cried out as they passed. "Margaret, please! Tell them there's been a mistake! Please!" But Margaret couldn't speak, couldn't move. She watched them put Clara into the back of a police car, watched the lights recede down the street, taking her daughter-in-law away into the night. When she finally turned around, Ethan was sitting on the stairs, his head in his hands, his entire body shaking. "Ethan?" Margaret's voice sounded strange to her own ears. "What is happening?" He didn't answer. He just sat there, rocking slightly like a child trying to comfort himself. And then one of the remaining officers approached Margaret, his expression grave. "Ma'am, I need to ask you some questions about your financial accounts." "My accounts?" "Yes, ma'am." He pulled out a notepad. "Did you know that your name was used to open 3 bank accounts last month?" Margaret's legs gave out. She sank onto the bottom step, the officer's words echoing in her skull. 3 bank accounts in her name. 3 bank accounts she knew nothing about. She looked up at her son, still sitting on the stairs above her. "Ethan," she whispered, "what did you do?" But he didn't answer. He just kept rocking, kept crying, as the first light of dawn began to break through the windows. And Margaret realized that everything she thought she knew about her son, about Clara, about the jewelry and the money and the lies had just been the surface. The truth was still waiting below, and it was going to destroy them all. The detective's name was Sarah Walsh. She was younger than Margaret expected, maybe 40, with sharp green eyes and an expression that gave nothing away. She sat across from Margaret in the living room as dawn broke fully, her notepad balanced on her knee. "Mrs. Reeves, I know this is overwhelming," Detective Walsh said, "but I need you to focus. Did you authorize anyone to open bank accounts in your name?" "No." Margaret's voice sounded hollow. "Never." "Did you give anyone access to your personal documents, social security number, driver's license?" Margaret tried to think. They live here. Ethan and Clara. My documents are in my office. I suppose they could have. She couldn't finish the sentence. The implication was too terrible. Detective Walsh nodded, making notes. When did they move in? 3 weeks ago. Ethan said they needed help, financial troubles. And before that, how often did you see them? Margaret had to think about this. Not much. Ethan and Clara got married 6 months ago. I wasn't at the wedding. They said it was a courthouse thing, very small. After that, maybe I saw them twice. Ethan would come by for Sunday dinner sometimes, but usually alone. Did you know Clara before the marriage? No. I met her at a family dinner about a month after the wedding. She seemed. Margaret paused, choosing her words carefully. Nice. A little hard to read, maybe, but nice. Detective Walsh wrote something down. Mrs. Reeves, I need to show you something. She opened a folder and pulled out several documents, bank statements, credit card applications, loan forms, all bearing Margaret's signature. Except it wasn't her signature. It was close, very close, but the loops were wrong, the slant slightly off. These were all opened in the past 6 weeks, Walsh explained. Total credit exposure is about $47,000. Most of it has already been spent or transferred. Margaret's vision swam. $47,000. I didn't sign these. I didn't sign any of this. We know. We have handwriting experts who can prove that. But Mrs. Reeves, I need to ask, did your son know about this? From the stairs, Ethan's voice cracked through the silence. No. Both women turned. Ethan stood at the bottom of the stairs, his face haggard. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour. I didn't know about the bank accounts. I didn't know about the credit cards. I just thought. He swallowed hard. I thought Clara needed help, medical help. She told me she had a heart condition, that the bills were killing us. I believed her. Detective Walsh's expression softened slightly. Mr. Reeves, I'm going to need you to come down to the station to give a formal statement. Am I under arrest? Not at this time, but you're certainly a person of interest. Ethan nodded numbly. He looked at his mother, and the pain in his eyes was so raw that Margaret had to look away. Mom, I swear to God, I didn't know. The jewelry, Margaret heard herself say. You sold my jewelry. You signed for it. Clara asked me to. She said she'd picked up some pieces from her grandmother's estate, but she didn't have an ID on her. She asked me to take them to the pawn shop for her. His voice cracked. I didn't look at them closely. I didn't realize they were yours until yesterday, when I saw them in Clara's drawer and recognized the pearls. The room was silent, except for the ticking of the old grandfather clock. Detective Walsh closed her folder. I need both of you to come down to the station. We have a lot to sort through, and I need official statements from everyone. The next few hours passed in a blur. Margaret sat in an interview room, gray walls, fluorescent lights, a table bolted to the floor. She answered questions until her voice went hoarse, told them everything she remembered about Clara, about the move-in, about the jewelry, about the whispered conversations. In another room, Ethan was doing the same, and somewhere in the building, Clara was in a holding cell. It was early afternoon when Detective Walsh finally let Margaret go home. She arranged for a patrol car to drive her back, and Margaret sat in the back seat, staring out at the world that seemed entirely foreign now. When she got home, Ethan was already there, sitting at the kitchen table. He didn't look up when she came in. Margaret sat down across from him. They stayed like that for a long time. Mother and son, separated by 3 feet and a chasm of broken trust. "Tell me the truth," Margaret said finally. "All of it." Ethan took a shaky breath. "I met Clara at a bar 10 months ago. She was beautiful, funny, smart. She seemed perfect. We dated for 2 months, and then she told me she was pregnant." Margaret's heart clenched. Pregnant? She lost the baby at 8 weeks. She was devastated. Ethan's voice was flat, robotic. "I proposed because I loved her, because I wanted to take care of her. We got married at the courthouse the next week." "Was she really pregnant?" Margaret asked quietly. Ethan finally looked up and his eyes were dead. "I don't know. She never showed me any medical records. I believed her." "What else?" "After we got married, the money problem started. Rent was due, bills piling up, her medical conditions. There was always something, always some crisis that needed money. I worked overtime, took out loans, maxed out my credit cards. I lost my job. They said I was embezzling." Margaret's breath caught. "Were you?" "No. But someone had been accessing the company accounts using my login. They couldn't prove I did it, so they couldn't press charges, but they fired me, blacklisted me." He met his mother's eyes. "It was Clara, Mom. I know it was. She had all my passwords. She had access to everything." The pieces were falling into place, painting a picture Margaret didn't want to see. "And you said nothing? Did nothing?" He confronted her. She cried, said I was being paranoid, said stress was making me crazy, and his voice broke. "I wanted to believe her. I loved her. I thought if I just tried harder, if I just fixed things, it would all be okay." Margaret reached across the table and took her son's hand. It was cold as ice. "The jewelry," she said. "Why did you really sign for it?" "She said if I didn't, she'd leave. She said I was a failure as a husband, that I couldn't even take care of her basic needs." "She said her grandmother's jewelry was all she had left, and if I wouldn't help her pawn it." He closed his eyes. "I just wanted her to stay. I didn't want to lose another person I loved." The confession hung in the air between them. "Ethan," Margaret said softly, "you haven't lost me." He started to cry then, deep, wrenching sobs that shook his whole body. Margaret came around the table and held him, and they stayed like that as the afternoon light faded into evening. Later that night, after Ethan had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep on the couch, Margaret sat in her office and opened her laptop. She typed, "Clara Reeves arrest record," and this time results flooded the screen. Clara Reeves, also known as Clara Morrison, Clara Stevens, and Catherine Reed. Arrested in Phoenix in 2019 for wire fraud. Arrested in Portland in 2021 for identity theft. Arrested in Denver in 2022 for credit card fraud. 3 different states, 3 different identities, 3 different families destroyed. Margaret clicked on an article from a Portland newspaper. Woman cons elderly couple out of retirement savings. There was a photo. Clara's face, younger, different hair color, but unmistakably her. The article described how she'd moved in with an elderly couple claiming to be their granddaughter's college roommate. Within 3 months, she drained their accounts and disappeared. Margaret kept clicking, kept reading. The pattern was always the same. Find someone vulnerable, someone lonely, someone grieving, someone desperate for connection. Win their trust, take everything, disappear. But this time, Clara had stayed. This time, she'd married in. Why? Margaret was still reading when her phone rang. Detective Walsh. Mrs. Reeves, I wanted to give you an update. Clara is being held on multiple charges. Her bail hearing is tomorrow, but given her flight risk and record, she'll likely be remanded. Thank you for letting me know. There is something else, Walsh paused. We recovered your jewelry from a storage unit Clara was renting. You'll be able to get it back once it's processed as evidence. Margaret should have felt relief, but all she felt was empty. Detective Walsh, why did she marry my son? Why go through all that when she could have just robbed me and left? The line was quiet for a moment. We're trying to figure that out, but Mrs. Reeves, I think there's more to this story. Clara keeps asking for you. For me? She says she'll only talk if you come to see her. She says there are things you need to know. About your husband. Margaret's blood turned cold. My husband has been dead for 3 years? I know, but Clara says she knew him, and she says everything you think you know about his death is wrong. The line went dead. Margaret sat in the darkness of her office, the phone still pressed to her ear, as the grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight. And she realized that the nightmare wasn't ending. It was only beginning. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She sat in her bedroom, staring at a photograph on her nightstand. It was from their 20th anniversary, her and David, arms wrapped around each other, laughing at some jokes she could no longer remember. He looked so alive in that photo, so present. 3 years ago, pancreatic cancer had stolen him away in 6 brutal months. From diagnosis to death, barely enough time to say goodbye. Or so she thought. At 7 in the morning, Margaret called Detective Walsh. I'll come, she said. I'll talk to Clara. 2 hours later, Margaret sat in a stark interview room at the county jail, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The door buzzed open and 2 guards brought Clara in. She looked different, without makeup, without the carefully styled hair. Younger, more vulnerable. She wore an orange jumpsuit that hung loose on her thin frame, and there were dark circles under her eyes. But when those blue eyes met Margaret's, there was something hard in them, something calculating. Thank you for coming, Clara said, sitting down across from her. Margaret said nothing, just waited. Clara folded her hands on the table. I want you to know that I never meant for it to go this far. That's the truth. The truth, Margaret repeated flatly. I'm not sure you know what that word means. A ghost of a smile crossed Clara's face. Fair enough. She leaned back in her chair. you know about your husband's last job before he retired?" Margaret frowned. "He was a financial consultant. He worked for Morrison and Associates." "That's what he told you, but that's not what he was." "What are you talking about?" Clara's expression was almost pitying. "David Reeves was a fixer, Margaret. Companies hired him to make their problems disappear. Accounting discrepancies, missing funds, whistleblowers. He made it all go away." "That's a lie." "Is it?" Clara leaned forward. "Why do you think you live in that big house? Why do you think Ethan went to private school? Your husband made a lot of money making problems disappear. And sometimes those problems were people." Margaret's hand shook. "Stop it!" "My father worked for Morrison and Associates," Clara continued, her voice steady. "His name was Richard Morrison. You can look it up. It was all over the news 12 years ago. Morrison and Associates, accountant sentenced for embezzlement. There are articles, court records, and at the bottom of every document, every piece of evidence, your husband's signature." The world tilted. Margaret gripped the edge of the table. "I was 16 when they took my father away. 16 when I watched him get handcuffed in our living room. My mother had a breakdown. We lost everything. Our house, our savings, our reputation. She drank herself to death before I turned 21. Tears streamed down Clara's face now, real and raw. "I spent years digging, Margaret. Years piecing together what really happened. And every trail led back to your husband, the man who smiled at cameras and played golf on weekends and destroyed my family." Margaret felt sick. So this was revenge. All of it. Marrying Ethan, moving into my home, stealing from me. At first, yes. Clara wiped her face roughly. "I found Ethan 2 years ago. I knew who he was, David Reeves' son. I tracked him, learned his routine, engineered a meeting." She laughed bitterly. It was supposed to be simple. Get close, take what I could, disappear. The way your husband disappeared with my father's life. But Ethan wasn't David. Clara's voice cracked. "He was kind, genuine. He actually cared about people. And She closed her eyes. "I fell in love with him. Really, actually fell in love, and that ruined everything." Margaret stared at this woman, this stranger who'd destroyed her family, who'd married her son under false pretenses, who'd stolen her identity. "You expect me to feel sorry for you?" Margaret asked quietly. "No," Clara said. "I expect you to understand that we're both victims of the same man. Your husband destroyed my family, and now I've destroyed yours. So we're even." "We are not even." Clara met her eyes. "Aren't we? You covered for him, Margaret, all those years. The expensive lawyers he kept on retainer, the documents he shredded in your home office at 3 a.m. You knew something was wrong. You just chose not to ask questions." The accusation hit like a physical blow. Because it was true. Margaret had known David kept secrets. She'd known his late-night phone calls and his locked filing cabinets, and his insistence that she never visit his office meant something. She just never let herself think too hard about what. "Did you kill my husband?" Margaret asked suddenly. Clara's eyes widened. What? No, Margaret, Did you? No, I swear. I never even met him. By the time I found Ethan, David had already been dead for a year. I wanted to hurt him, yes. I wanted to make him pay. But cancer got him first. Margaret stood up, her legs shaking. I don't believe anything you say. Then look it up. Richard Morrison, Morrison and Associates, 2011. It's all there, Margaret. Every terrible detail. There's one more thing you should know. Margaret turned at the door. Your husband had an affair. 28 years ago, when you and he were going through that rough patch after Ethan was born, the woman's name was Linda Chen. She had a daughter. Your husband paid child support for years through offshore accounts, so you'd never know. Margaret gripped the doorframe. You're lying. Her name is Sophie Chen. She lives in Seattle. She's an artist, and she has no idea her father is dead because David never told her his real name. He used an alias, Michael Ross. Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded photograph. A guard immediately tensed, but Clara just slid it across the table. Take it, she said. Look at her. Then tell me I'm lying. Margaret didn't want to. Every instinct told her to walk away, to refuse to engage with this manipulator, this thief, this destroyer of families. But she crossed back to the table, picked up the photograph. It was a woman in her late 20s, standing in front of a mural she'd clearly painted. She had dark hair, pulled back in a ponytail, high cheekbones, strong features, and David's eyes, unmistakably his eyes. Margaret's knees buckled. The guard caught her, helped her to the chair. I found her 2 years ago, Clara said quietly. While I was researching David, I thought about telling her the truth, thought about destroying her peace the way mine was destroyed. But I couldn't. She didn't do anything wrong. She's just collateral damage, like all of us. Margaret stared at the photo, at this daughter she never knew existed, this half-sister Ethan had never met. Why are you telling me this? She whispered. Because I'm tired, Clara said. Tired of lying, tired of hurting people, tired of carrying this alone. She met Margaret's eyes. And because you deserve to know the truth about David, about everything. Maybe then you'll understand why I did what I did. It doesn't excuse it. No, Clara agreed. It doesn't. Margaret stood again, still clutching the photograph. She looked at Clara, really looked at her, saw the scared girl beneath the con artist, the daughter who'd lost everything, the woman who'd been destroyed and had decided to destroy in return. I can't forgive you, Margaret said. I know. And I can't save you. Whatever happens to you now is justice. I know that too. Margaret walked to the door, then paused. The jewelry. Why did you keep it? You could have sold it, disappeared with the money. Clara smiled sadly. Because they were beautiful. And because they were the only pieces of your life I actually wanted to keep. She paused. Your grandmother had good taste. The door buzzed open and Margaret stepped through it, leaving Clara behind in that gray room. But she carried the photograph with her, and she carried the terrible knowledge that everything she'd believed about her life, her marriage, her husband, all of it had been
a lie. Margaret sat in Detective Walsh's office, the photograph of Sophie Chen on the desk between them. "I need you to verify something," Margaret said, her voice hollow. "I need to know if this woman is really David's daughter." Walsh picked up the photo, studied it. "I can run it through our databases, see what we find. But Margaret, this might not be something you want to know for certain. I have to know." 3 days later, Walsh called. The DNA comparison Margaret had authorized using David's old razor from a box in the garage confirmed it. Sophie Chen was David Reeves' biological daughter. Margaret hung up the phone and sat in silence for an hour, staring at nothing. When Ethan came home that evening, he found his mother in the living room, surrounded by boxes. She'd pulled out every document, every file, every piece of paper from David's home office. "Mom, what are you doing?" Margaret looked up, her eyes red from crying. "Looking for the truth." "About what?" "Sit down, Ethan." And she told him everything. About Clara's father, about David's work as a fixer, about the embezzlement and the frame-up, and the man who'd killed himself because her husband had destroyed his life. Ethan listened, his face growing paler with every word.
"No," he said finally. "Dad wouldn't do that. He was a good man. He was he?" Margaret pulled out a folder. "I found these, and a box in the attic. Your father kept them hidden." She spread the documents across the coffee table. Bank statements from offshore accounts, payments to Linda Chen, legal documents with Richard Morrison's forged signature, and at the bottom of the box, a letter. Ethan picked up the letter with shaking hands. It was from Richard Morrison, written from prison. "David, I know you did this. I know you framed me. One day the truth will come out, and everyone will know what kind of man you really are. I hope you can live with yourself. I hope you can look your son in the eye and know that you built his life on my destroyed one. But most of all, I hope karma finds you, because I can't. Richard." Ethan set the letter down like it was burning him. When did he get this? According to the postmark, 3 months before Richard died. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "Your father kept it, like a trophy." Maybe there's an explanation. Maybe, Ethan. Margaret took her son's hands. "I loved your father, but I've spent the last 3 days going through everything, and I can't deny it anymore. He wasn't who I thought he was." "So Clara was right. Dad destroyed her family?" "Yes." Ethan stood up, pacing the room like a caged animal. "Then what does that make me? The son of a man who ruined people's lives? What does that make us?" "It makes us human," Margaret said quietly. "It makes us people who loved someone who did terrible things." She paused. "There's more." "More? How can there possibly be more?" Margaret held out the photograph of Sophie Chen. "You have a sister." Ethan stared at the photo like it might explode. "What?" Margaret explained about Linda Chen, about the affair, about the payments, and the secret life David had kept hidden for nearly 30 years. When she finished, Ethan sank back onto the couch, his head in his hands. "I don't know who we are anymore," he whispered. "We're the same people we were yesterday. We just know more now." "Are we? Because yesterday I thought I knew my father. I thought I knew what our family was built on. And now," he looked up at his mother, tears streaming down his face. "Now I don't know anything." Margaret sat beside him, and they held each other in the wreckage of their family's secrets.
Mom, Ethan said after a long moment, Clara said you covered for Dad, that you knew something was wrong. Is that true? The question Margaret had been dreading. She took a deep breath. Yes. Ethan pulled back, looking at her. Your father came home one night, about 12 years ago, Margaret continued, her voice shaking. He was terrified. Said something had happened at work, that he might be in trouble. He asked me to help him shred documents, hundreds of pages. And I did. Why? Because he was my husband, because he said he was protecting us, and because I swallowed hard. Because I was afraid of what would happen if I asked too many questions. We had this house. You were in private school. We had a life. And I didn't want to lose it. So you helped him destroy evidence. Yes, evidence that might have saved Clara's father. The words hung between them like a blade. I didn't know, Margaret whispered. I didn't know what the documents were for. I didn't know about Richard Morrison. But Ethan, you're right. If I'd asked questions, if I'd looked at what I was destroying, she closed her eyes. Maybe things would have been different. They sat in silence, mother and son, both carrying the weight of David Reeves' sins. What do we do now? Ethan asked finally. Margaret looked at the photograph of Sophie Chen. We find her. We tell her the truth. And we try to make amends for what your father did. And Clara? Margaret's jaw tightened. Clara made her choices. She hurt innocent people. You, me, probably dozens of others. Her pain doesn't excuse that. But we hurt her family first. We did. Your father did. And I helped him hide it. Margaret met her son's eyes. So maybe Clara was right. Maybe we're all just victims of the same man. But that doesn't mean what she did was okay. Two wrongs don't make a right. Ethan nodded slowly. I found something too, he said quietly. In Clara's things, while you were at the jail. He pulled a manila envelope from his jacket pocket and handed it to his mother. Inside was another photograph. It showed Clara, younger, maybe 23 or 24, standing beside a man in a suit. He had his arm around her shoulders, and they were both smiling at the camera. Behind them was an office building with a sign, Morrison and Associates. And the man in the suit was David Reeves. Margaret's blood turned to ice. When was this taken? Ethan turned the photo over. On the back, in Clara's handwriting, the day I met the devil. 6 months before Dad's arrest. She knew him. Margaret breathed. She knew your father. She met him. She lied, Ethan said. His voice was hollow. In the jail. She said she never met him. But she did. Margaret stared at the photograph, her mind racing. If Clara had met David, if she'd been to Morrison and Associates 6 months before the arrest, if she had been lying, she was there, Margaret said suddenly. She was there when it happened. She saw something, knew something, or did something, Ethan finished quietly. They looked at each other, and a new terrible possibility began to take shape. What if Clara hadn't just been a victim? What if she had been involved all along? Detective Walsh listened to their theory in silence, her expression unreadable. So you think Clara Morrison, her real name is Morrison? Margaret interrupted. Walsh nodded. Catherine Clara Morrison. She started using her middle name after her father died. We confirmed it this morning. She paused. You think she was involved in her own father's downfall? I don't know, Margaret admitted. But she met my husband. She was at his office 6 months before the arrest. And she's been lying about it. That doesn't prove anything. But it's suspicious, Ethan insisted. Why lie about meeting him if she have nothing to hide?
Walsh was quiet for a moment, then opened her laptop. "There's something I haven't told you yet."
We've been going through Clara's communications, emails, text messages, phone records. Most of it is what you'd expect. Coordinating frauds, contacting Marks. But there's one number she's been calling regularly for years, every few weeks, always from a burner phone. Whose number? Walsh turned the laptop around. On the screen was a call log, highlighting one number that appeared dozens of times. We traced it. It belongs to a Lawrence Hartwell. He was Richard Morrison's lawyer. Margaret's breath caught. Her father's lawyer? Why would she be calling him? That's what we wanted to know. So we brought him in for questioning this morning. Walsh pulled up her notes. Hartwell claims he's been managing a trust fund for Clara, one that was set up before Richard Morrison went to prison. A trust fund? Ethan leaned forward. How much? $2 million. The room went silent. Where did that money come from? Margaret asked. That's the interesting part, Walsh said. According to Hartwell, the money came from Richard Morrison himself. He set up the trust the week before he was arrested, transferring funds from multiple offshore accounts. Margaret felt like the floor was dropping out from under her. Richard Morrison was embezzling. Clara's father really was stealing from Morrison and Associates. It appears so, Walsh confirmed. But here's where it gets complicated. We compared the accounts Richard used to the accounts your husband had access to. There's significant overlap. Meaning? Meaning either Richard Morrison was working alone and happened to use accounts your husband also controlled, or, Walsh paused, they were working together. Ethan stood up, pacing. Dad and Richard were partners? They were stealing together? It's possible. And if they were, then David's embezzlement frame-up makes more sense. He turned on his partner, made Richard take the fall for both of them. Margaret's mind was reeling. But Clara said she lost everything, that her family was destroyed. Publicly, yes. Her mother did have a breakdown, their house was foreclosed, but Clara had $2 million waiting for her. She could have accessed that money at any time after she turned 21. She didn't have to spend years running cons and stealing identities. So why did she? Ethan asked. Because it was never about the money, Margaret said quietly. It was about making us suffer, making David's family feel what she felt. Walsh nodded. Revenge is a powerful motivator, and Clara Morrison has proven to be very, very patient. That night, Margaret couldn't stay in the house. Everything felt contaminated now. Every room, every piece of furniture, every memory. David had walked these floors, slept in this bed, eaten at this table, and all the while he'd been lying, stealing, destroying lives. She drove to a hotel and checked in under her own name, grateful for the anonymity. She was sitting in the small room, staring at the television without seeing it, when her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Margaret? The voice was familiar, but wrong somehow, distorted. Who is this? Someone who knew your husband. Someone who knows the truth about what happened. Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. Clara? No, but I was there, at Morrison and Associates. I saw what David did, what they both did. A pause. If you want to know the whole truth, meet me tomorrow, 9 p.m., the parking garage on Elm Street, 4th floor. Come alone. Why should I trust you? Because I'm the only one who can tell you why your husband really died. The line went dead. Margaret sat frozen, her heart hammering. Why your husband really died. David had died of cancer, pancreatic cancer. The doctors had been certain, hadn't they? Margaret pulled out her laptop and opened David's medical records, files she'd barely looked at since his death. Death certificate, oncology reports, treatment history. She read through them carefully this time, really read them. David had been diagnosed in February, 3 years ago. Dead by August, 6 months, just like the doctors predicted. But as Margaret read deeper, she found something strange. David's first symptoms, jaundice, weight loss, abdominal pain, had started in December. He'd gone to a doctor in January, but the tests came back negative, no cancer. It wasn't until February, after a second round of tests at a different hospital, that the cancer appeared, suddenly, aggressively, inoperable. Could cancer appear that fast? Margaret Googled, "Can pancreatic cancer develop in 1 month?" The answer was no. Pancreatic cancer typically takes years to develop. By the time symptoms appear, it's usually been growing for a long time. So why had David's first tests been negative? Margaret's hands shook as she clicked through more records. She found the name of the doctor who'd ordered David's February tests, Dr. James Winters, oncology specialist. She Googled him. Dr. James Winters had lost his medical license 3 years ago. Reason? Accepting bribes to falsify medical records. Margaret's phone slipped from her hands. Someone had paid Dr. Winters to diagnose David with cancer, to create a false medical trail, to make his death look natural. But if David hadn't died of cancer, how had he died? And who had killed him? Margaret grabbed her phone and called Detective Walsh. It went to voicemail. "Detective, it's Margaret Reeves. I need you to call me immediately. I think my husband was murdered. I think—" Thunder crashed outside, shaking the hotel windows. Rain began to pound against the glass, heavy and violent. Margaret's phone buzzed. A text from the unknown number. "Tomorrow night, come alone, or you'll never know the truth." Margaret sat in the darkness of her hotel room, watching the storm rage outside, and realized that nothing, absolutely nothing, had been what it seemed. Her husband, her marriage, her family, her life. All of it had been built on lies. And somewhere out there, someone knew the whole truth. Someone who'd been watching, waiting. Someone who might have killed David Reeves and who might come for her next. Margaret didn't go to the meeting. Instead, she went to the hospital where Clara had been taken after a late-night incident at the jail. What Detective Walsh described carefully over the phone as a medical emergency. When Margaret arrived, Clara was in a private room, handcuffed to the bed rail. She looked small against the white sheets, an IV in her arm, her face pale and drawn. A guard stood outside the door, but Walsh was inside, waiting. She overdosed, hoarded medication, took it all at once. They found her unresponsive during bed check. Margaret looked at Clara's sleeping face. Even now, even knowing everything, part of her felt pity. Will she survive? Yes, physically. Walsh paused. But she's asking for you again. She says she has something to give you. Evidence. Evidence of what? She won't say. Just that you need to see it before tomorrow night. Margaret frowned. How does she know about tomorrow night? Walsh's expression darkened. That's what worries me. Someone's been feeding her information from outside. We just don't know who. Clara's eyes fluttered open. She focused slowly on Margaret, then smiled weakly. You came. I shouldn't have. But you did. Because you need answers. Clara's voice was raspy. The meeting tomorrow. Don't go. Why not? Because it's a trap. And because the person who contacted you is the same person who killed your husband. Margaret's blood ran cold. Who? Clara closed her eyes. I need you to do something first. Under my mattress at your house, there's an envelope in the guest room. Get it. Read it. Then you'll understand everything. Why can't you just tell me? Because you won't believe me unless you see the proof. Clara opened her eyes again, and they were filled with tears. I've lied to you about so many things, Margaret, but I'm not lying about this. Your husband was murdered, and the killer is still out there. 2 hours later, Margaret stood in her guest bedroom with Ethan and Detective Walsh. They'd searched the mattress and found it, a manila envelope taped to the underside. Inside were documents, medical records, financial transactions, and photographs. Lots of photographs. The first showed David having lunch with a woman Margaret didn't recognize. Dark hair, business suit, smiling over coffee. The second showed David entering a hotel with the same woman. The third showed David kissing her. Another affair, Margaret said numbly. But Walsh was looking at something else. Margaret, who is this? She pointed to one of the documents, an employment record from Morrison at Associates. Name, Linda Chen. Position, executive assistant to David Reeves. Employment dates, 2008 to 2012. Linda Chen whispered in. She worked for David. She was his assistant. Walsh kept flipping through the documents. Look at this. It was a bank statement showing regular transfers from Richard Morrison's accounts to Linda Chen. Thousands of dollars, over months. Richard Morrison was paying Linda Chen, said Margaret slowly. Why? The answer came from the next document. A letter, handwritten, from Linda to Richard. Richard, I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen. David said he would protect both of us. He said if I testified that you'd signed those documents, if I backed up his story, we'd all be safe. But now he's cutting me loose. He says the affair was a mistake. He says he's going back to his wife. I'm pregnant, Richard, with David's child, and he's threatening to destroy me if I don't disappear. He says he'll make sure I never work again, that he'll take the baby. I know you're innocent. I know David framed you. I'm so sorry I helped him do it. Please forgive me. Linda was the witness. She was the one who testified against Richard Morrison. And she was lying. David forced her to lie.
And Richard paid her to keep quiet, Walsh added. These transfers, they're hush money. He was trying to protect his daughter before he went to prison. Ethan was staring at another photograph. Mom, look at this. It was a recent photo, taken maybe 3 years ago based on David's age. He was in his study at home, working at his desk. But he wasn't alone. Standing behind him, visible in the reflection of the window, was someone with a camera. Someone who'd been watching him. The figure was blurry, but the outline was clear. A woman with dark hair pulled back, holding a professional camera with a long lens. Margaret's hands shook as she pulled out the photograph of Sophie Chen. Dark hair, high cheekbones, David's eyes. Sophie, she whispered. Sophie's been watching him. Walsh grabbed her phone, already dialing. We need to find Sophie Chen, now. But Margaret was putting pieces together, and the picture forming was terrifying. Linda wrote that letter 28 years ago. Sophie would have been an infant. But Linda died. When? Clara said she drank herself to death, but... I'll check, Walsh said, typing on her phone. Linda Chen, Seattle. Her face paled. "Margaret, Linda Chen died 3 years ago. August. Cause of death? Stroke." "The same month David died," Ethan said quietly. "Sophie lost her mother," Margaret continued, her voice shaking. "And maybe Linda finally told her the truth before she died, told her who her father really was, what he'd done. And Sophie came looking for him," Walsh finished. "She came for revenge." The final document in the envelope was a medical report for David Reeves. But this wasn't from Dr. Winters. This was from the first doctor, the one who tested David in January and found nothing wrong. There was a note paperclipped to it, in Clara's handwriting. "Your husband's tests were negative because he didn't have cancer, but someone had access to his food, his medicine, someone who knew exactly what chemicals could mimic pancreatic cancer symptoms, someone with a chemistry degree and a grudge. I've been tracking Sophie for 2 years. She knew about me, about my plan, and she reached out, said we should work together, take down David's family from the inside. I said no, because by then I'd fallen in love with Ethan, and I didn't want anyone else to get hurt. But Sophie didn't stop. She killed your husband, Margaret, slowly, carefully, made it look like cancer, and now she wants to finish the job. Don't trust her, don't meet her, and protect your son." Walsh was already on her phone, calling for backup, coordinating with the Seattle police. But Margaret was staring at the photograph of Sophie Chen, this daughter she'd never known, this woman who carried David's eyes and her mother's pain, this killer who'd murdered her husband. "We need to cancel the meeting," Walsh said. "It's too dangerous." But Ethan was looking at his phone, his face white. "Mom, I just got a text." He held up the screen. The message was from an unknown number. "Hi, brother. I'm outside. Let's talk about Dad." Walsh pulled her gun and moved to the window. Margaret and Ethan followed. Outside, standing in the driveway, illuminated by the porch light, was a woman with dark hair.
She wore a long coat and held a phone in one hand. She looked up at the window and waved. Sophie Chen had come to them. "Nobody moves," Walsh commanded, speaking into her radio. "Suspect on site. Need immediate backup." But Sophie was already walking toward the house, her stride confident and unhurried. Margaret watched her approach. This daughter born from betrayal, raised in lies, shaped by grief into something dangerous. And she knew with terrible certainty that this was how the story had always been meant to end, with all of David Reeves's sins coming home and his family left to answer for them. They arrested Sophie Chen in Margaret's living room. She didn't resist, just stood there calmly as they read her rights, handcuffed her, led her toward the door. But as she passed Margaret, she stopped. "Do you know what it's like," Sophie said quietly, "to discover that your whole life was a lie? That the father you never met was actually a monster? That your mother died protecting his secrets?" Margaret didn't answer, couldn't answer. "I watched him for 6 months before I made my move. Watched him live his perfect life in this perfect house with his perfect family. And I thought, why does he get peace? Why does he get to grow old while my mother drank herself to death at 43? While Clara's father put a gun in his mouth? While how many other people did he destroy?" "So you killed him," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I gave him justice," Sophie corrected. "Slow poison, mercury and arsenic, small doses in his vitamins, enough to create symptoms, enough to make him suffer. By the time he figured out something was wrong, it was too late. His organs were failing. And that quack doctor I paid to fake the cancer diagnosis, he made sure David spent his last months believing it was nature that betrayed him, not me. Ethan made a choked sound. Detective Walsh tightened her grip on Sophie's arm. "You're a murderer," Margaret said. "I'm my father's daughter. He destroyed people with papers and lies. I destroyed one person with poison and patience. Which of us is worse?" She didn't wait for an answer. The officers let her out, and through the window, Margaret watched them put her into a police car. This daughter she'd never know. This half-sister Ethan would never have. Another piece of David's legacy, broken and lost. The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal proceedings and media attention. Clara's trial, Sophie's arraignment, Ethan giving testimony, Margaret sitting in courtroom after courtroom listening to lawyers argue about culpability and intent and justice. Clara got 8 years for fraud and identity theft. The judge was lenient because of her cooperation, because of the evidence she had provided about Sophie, because Margaret suspected they pitied her. Sophie got life without parole. No one pitied her. And Ethan moved out, got a small apartment across town, started therapy, started trying to figure out who he was beyond his father's son and his mother's keeper. Margaret let him go. He needed to heal. They both did. 3 months after the arrests, Margaret stood in her bedroom looking at the jewelry box on her dresser.
The police had returned everything. The pearls, the sapphires, her wedding ring. All of it cleaned and cataloged and officially given back. She opened the box and looked at the pieces. They were beautiful, historic, worth a small fortune. And she couldn't stand to look at them. These weren't symbols of love anymore. They were evidence, pieces in a puzzle that revealed betrayal and lies and death. Margaret closed the box and carried it downstairs. She drove to David's grave, the first time she'd been there since before Clara moved in. The headstone was simple granite with his name and dates. No flowery epitaph, no declarations of eternal love. Just David Michael Reeves, 1960-2021, beloved husband and father. Margaret sat on the grass beside the stone and set the jewelry box on top of it. "I don't know who you were," she said aloud. "I thought I did. I thought 30 years of marriage meant I knew you. But I didn't know anything." The cemetery was quiet, just birds and wind and the distant sound of traffic. "Richard Morrison is dead because of you. Linda Chen drank herself to death because of you. Your daughter became a killer because of you. Clara became a con artist because of you. And Ethan," her voice broke, "Ethan has to live his whole life carrying the weight of what you did." She opened the jewelry box one last time, looking at the pearls that had been passed down through generations. Her grandmother's hands had worn these. Her mother's, hers. But they'd never make it to the next generation, because some inheritances were too heavy to pass down. "I loved you, Margaret. God help me, I still do. But I can't keep these. I can't keep pretending that our life together was something it wasn't." She closed the box and left it there, on top of his grave. Then she stood and walked away. 6 months later, Margaret sat in her kitchen, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper. The house was quiet, truly quiet, for the first time in years. No footsteps overhead, no whispered conversations, no lies hiding in the corners. Just peace. Complicated, hard-won, imperfect peace.
Her phone buzzed. A text from Ethan. "Coming by for dinner tonight? I'm bringing someone. Her name is Amy. I think you'll like her." Margaret smiled. Her son was healing. Slowly, carefully, but healing. She typed back that, "I'd love that. 6 p.m.? Perfect. Love you, Mom." "Love you too, sweetheart." Margaret set down her phone and looked around her kitchen. This house held so many memories, good and bad, true and false, beautiful and terrible. But it was still hers, and she was still here. The doorbell rang. Margaret opened it to find a FedEx delivery person holding a package. Margaret Reeves?" "Yes." "Sign here, please." She signed and took the package. No return address, just her name in careful handwriting. Inside was a framed painting, abstract, bold strokes of blue and gold and red, and tucked in the corner so small she almost missed it was a signature, S. Chen. There was a note. "Mrs. Reeves, I'm writing this from prison, where I'll spend the rest of my life. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to have this. I painted it after my mother died, when I was trying to make sense of everything I'd learned. It's called inheritance. We inherit so much from our parents, their eyes, their smile, their talents. But we also inherit their sins, their mistakes, their debts. The question is, what do we do with that inheritance? Do we pass it on? Do we let it destroy us? Or do we find a way to transform it into something new? I chose destruction. Clara chose revenge. Your son is choosing healing. What will you choose? Sophie. Margaret stared at the painting for a long time. Then she hung it in her hallway, right across from a photo of Ethan as a child, laughing, innocent, unburdened by the weight of his father's choices. That evening, David arrived with Amy, a kind-faced woman who worked at the library and made Ethan smile in a way Margaret hadn't seen in years. They ate dinner together, talking about small things and future plans and hope. And when they'd gone, Margaret sat alone in her living room, looking at Sophie's painting and thinking about inheritance, about the sins of the fathers being visited upon the sons, about cycles of pain and revenge and justice, about what it meant to break free. The jewelry box was still sitting on David's grave. Margaret had driven by last week and seen it there, weathered by rain and sun, its contents probably stolen by now. She didn't mind. Some things were meant to be left behind. Some inheritances were meant to end. Margaret picked up her phone and opened a blank email. She found the address for the University of Washington Art Department where Sophie's bio said she'd once studied. To whom it may concern, I would like to establish a scholarship fund in honor of Linda Chen and Richard Morrison for students studying art and accounting, respectively, for young people trying to build lives not defined by their parents' mistakes. Please let me know what information you need from me. Sincerely, Margaret Reeves. She hit send. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't justice. It wasn't even really healing. But it was a start. A way to transform inheritance from burden into gift. A way to break the cycle. Margaret stood and walked to her window, looking out at the street she lived on for 30 years. Tomorrow, she'd start sorting through David's remaining things. Next week, she'd meet with a therapist. Next month, maybe she'd take that painting class she'd always wanted to try.
The past couldn't be changed. The sins couldn't be undone. But the future was still unwritten. And Margaret Reeves was finally ready to write her own story. Not as David's wife, not as Clara's victim, not as anyone's legacy, just as herself.
Broken, healing, free. In the end, truth always finds its way home. Sometimes through pain, sometimes through love, sometimes through the terrible reckoning of sins left too long in darkness. We inherit so much from the people who came before us. Their dreams, their fears, their choices. But we also have the power to choose what we keep and what we let go. The jewelry box still sits on David Reeves' grave, empty now, its treasures scattered to the wind. But the house on Maple Street still stands. And in it, a woman who lost everything is learning to build something new. Not from gold or sapphires or pearls, but from forgiveness, from courage, from the quiet understanding that love, real love, isn't about what we inherit. It's about what we choose to become, despite everything, because of everything. In the ashes of one family's destruction, a new story begins. And this time, it's hers to tell.